Welcome to the Naked Folk podcast. I'm your host, Haley Folk. Our guest for today is Avril Louise. She's an intimacy coordinator and sexologist for Erica Lust. Check out my personal favorite Erica Lust brand, X Confessions, with a 1-month free trial at the link below. I hope you're as excited for this episode as I am. Are you ready to get naked? For joining me. Today we have Avril Clark. She is a sexologist and an intimacy coordinator at Erica Lust. Thank you so much for taking the time to join. I'm really excited to talk to you today about all things intimacy, sex, porn as it relates to relationships. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I have read a lot about you and your work, and I'm a big fan. I actually had the opportunity to work with the Erica Lust team on several other projects, and I even came to Barcelona last year in March to be on set and kind of experience what it's like to be in the industry in a women-led space, which I thought was so cool. And I would love to hear from you just a little bit about yourself, how you categorize your work, and what is important to you about your work.
Yeah, okay, so that's really cool to know that you're so familiar already with our work. It kind of helps show that you have that on-set experience as well, which I think is really important to the work that we do.
Mhm.
So categorizing my work is tricky because I think I'm a clinical sexologist by trade, so obviously this means that I can wear lots of different hats, which is fun. So it can range from, giving couples therapy to helping develop Erica's sex education nonprofit project, Porn Conversation, to being on set and working as an intimacy coordinator. So I really like how I've been able to diversify the work that I do while kind of keeping that common thread of sexual health and wellness. And so it's been really interesting to kind of delve into all these different sides of the industry. It's been fun building brands. It's been fun getting the opportunities to work within the porn industry as well, understanding that. And it's just interesting to see where else it'll take me.
Yeah, I mean, I know, like, from my perspective, having been a sex and relationships writer for a long time and then also working in the industry and talking to people in the porn industry, I think that it's really misunderstood in a lot of ways, especially in the ethical space. I would love to hear more about how you personally feel about being able to work in the ethical porn space in comparison to, like, if you were just working in the mainstream industry.
Yeah, I mean, so I feel like I can speak from the perspective of working with Erica Lust because it has honestly been the only production studio, only director, well, not only director, that's not right, but the only production studio that I've worked with. And so I feel like there's always a lot of comparisons between ethically produced porn versus mainstream porn, and I do think there is so much commonality between the work we do. At the end of the day, we're creating porn. It's a type of mainstream media that's sexualized. We work closely with performers who work not only within the ethically produced porn industry, but also within what sometimes people call the mainstream industry, so, the tube sites. And so I feel like there's so much more commonalities, and this is a very important thing because I feel like the industry is shifting in this moment. So what is these like ethically, or what I say, ethical standards becoming more mainstream has been the really exciting part to see.
I think that that's so cool and spot on. And I also, when I've done work with Erica before, I have had the opportunity to really see, like, what is changing about the industry and how it's sort of being impacted as a whole by her work. And I think it's so needed. I think porn is such a part of a lot of people's lives, and a lot of people choose to kind of like not think of it that way, but it's true. Like, I think it's ingrained in so many people's individual lives and then also lives as a couple. Um, I would love to talk about first what it means to be an intimacy coordinator, because for people who don't know, I didn't know before I was like on a set and what that could actually mean. So, what, how do you define that? And also, like, what is your favorite part about that role?
Yeah, definitely. So I think like I do want to talk about something that you mentioned at the beginning when you were saying like a lot of people don't feel like they're necessarily a part of the porn industry. I think it comes with like that consumer responsibility to recognize that as a consumer of porn, as someone who maybe watches it regularly or every once in a while, or have in your life, like you are a part of that industry, right? So wherever you're putting your energy, your money, and your time is an industry that you are at the end of the day supporting and are a part of. So I think it's really nice because I think what we do at Erica Lust is really kind of like pull back the curtains there and showing that transparency as far as like what are the things we do on set, what values we hold, and what practices we do to then be considered this ethical production company. And with that also comes the work of intimacy coordination. So that was a really interesting role that I got to create and curate when I entered the company. I knew that there was already these great practices going on set. We have very strict guidelines that we hold through every production. So from STI testing to sex talks, which are like the consent and boundary conversations. But typically, these were something that would be done through a talent manager. And so when I entered the company as kind of like the in-house sexologist, I was like, okay, I see this like growing role a lot in Hollywood that kind of was born out of the Me Too movement, which is called intimacy coordination, protecting the actors on set when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
anything that had to do with any intimate scenes, from kissing to, I don't know, having a sex scene, right? But I would say the big difference was I was noticing that, you know, in a porn set, well, people are actually having sex. This is not mimicking, this is not using modesty garments to cover genitals, so there's no genital to genital contact. It's like it's actually happening. So what is interesting though is like there still is a huge role that fantasy plays within porn, just as in TV series, films, and including our films. And so that was a role that I just saw that was needed, and I
Mm-hmm.
felt that there was such a connection between what was happening in Hollywood as far as like having this role being a part of regular production processes versus what we're doing. Obviously, ours would include, I organize STI testings, I organize conversations between the performers about their results and about the sex scene and contraceptives. But it just felt like the next step, and it was something that I think that most intimacy coordinators, whether they work in Hollywood or they're working in porn sets, um, would agree is something we need to talk about more, and we need people to be aware of the importance of. And I think we're constantly seeing in the media stories coming out about how intimacy coordination has positively affected some performers or actors' experiences on sets. So it's at the end of the day, it's just all about creating safer sets and
Mm-hmm.
having safer sex. So
I
it's really interesting.
Yeah, I something that really stuck with me when I was on set was the intimacy coordination process. Like I love that you call it a sex talk. Also, I just think that that's so it goes back to your roots of like, oh, when you have that sex talk with your parents, except you're like working on a set and you do it multiple times and it doesn't just happen once, it happens 3 or 4 times throughout the day every time you are about to go into a scene. And um, I also really, something that I talked to the intimacy coordinator on set about was the idea of what happens if someone is uncomfortable with something, or if they need some special aftercare, which I know can be a part of the process. Is that something that you've personally sort of dealt with on set as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's all about the importance of these conversations. So if there's something that someone is not comfortable with, it doesn't happen, period. I think that there's a really nice understanding between the performers. Okay, so I can give an example, right? Maybe there's a three-person scene, and two of the performers have put on their forms that contraceptive, like barrier method contraceptives, so using a condom is not important to them in that scene. But one performer says that they would prefer to use a condom, whether or not receiving or giving.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, there's a conversation, and we're going to side with the performer who wants to use the contraceptive method. There's kind of like non-negotiables there when it comes to safety and protection of performers. Um, so that is something that is always spoken about, and I think that has been a really nice conversation because at the end of the day, the performer's interest is also their pleasure, but also making the scene the best they can. And that also includes having clear and consensual conversations with each other before going into the sex scene, just to make sure that everyone feels good and comfortable going into it. When it comes to aftercare, of course, that's important as well. So that would mean me checking in with each performer after the sex scene, seeing like what they might need in that moment, whether or not it's space and time, or they want water and to take a walk, or they want to just sit down and they're fine with like having a conversation and want to talk it through with somebody. Everyone will have their different ways of how they would like to receive aftercare, and this doesn't just mean right after the sex scene, because that can be kind of a hectic moment where things are kind of like cooling down. You're on a film set, things are changing, lots of moving parts and pieces. But it could also mean checking in the day after, 2 days after, a week after, kind of having that consistent communication, that knowing that that door is always open. Just when we finish today and go home doesn't mean that my job is finished and I'm not going to think about it again. So it's all about kind of understanding what are the needs and the preferences of each performer, and then going along with that.
Mm-hmm. That makes so much sense to me, and I think it's really probably very comforting as a performer to be in a space where you can have those conversations and not feel judged and feel listened to, and um, have the autonomy to say like, "Hey, I'm not comfortable with this, and I want to do something else," and that's amazing. Um, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about and go back to the idea of porn being a part of your life individually or as a couple. I talk to a lot of men specifically who maybe say that they consume porn pretty regularly. And then you talk to their partner, and the woman says maybe not as much, but they still consume it, but they don't watch it together. Which I always find interesting
Right.
because as a woman, like, I watch porn and I watch it with my partner and we choose to do that together. But most couples I meet would say the opposite. They're like, oh, we do it alone, but not together. And I think that it can be a really beautiful way to bring sexuality and experience with your partner together and build intimacy. Um, I'm wondering what your perspective is on sort of like couples watching porn together in general. Um, and then if you have any advice for couples who maybe want to watch it but don't know how to approach that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's good that people watch porn alone or with partners, or also if they're not comfortable watching it with their partner, that's okay too. It can
Mhm.
definitely be part of your own sexual private practice. Um, I think it's important also to have your own relationship with yourself when it comes to sexuality. I think oftentimes we forget to have that. So that is going to be something that might include watching porn or not. And so I think that's also good to honor, because oftentimes I would say there's like two topics when it comes to typical sex education conversations. that are just kind of seen as these taboo and always often private moments, which is going to be masturbation and watching porn. But we all know how common these things are. So it's kind of like having these conversations, and we're seeing the topic of masturbation and porn becoming more normalized, is going to be the first step, because it's really difficult for someone who might have this stigma against it or this internalized shame about masturbating or watching porn, that they won't see it as something they can speak to their partner about. Um, so overcoming that shame, I know that's very uh, easier said than done kind of statement, but just recognizing just how popular it is. You know, porn is a form of mass media. It's as big as it is for a reason. It's very commonly consumed. And oftentimes people will be more open to sharing with their partners about just some of the porn that they watch. Oftentimes they would like to keep some private for themselves. So there's always going to be these levels of shame and stigma, I believe, when it comes to your comfort about conversing with your partner about what you're watching. But I think that, like you said, it can be a really, really great time to connect with a partner sexually and to share these desires and to share what you're into. And it could be a really fun practice. So even if it means subscribing to Erica Less platform with your partner and having a shared account, and scrolling through the pages and looking up different types of porn and having discussions with each other simply by asking, what do you like about this? What turns you on about this? But also, what doesn't turn you on about this? It can be this really nice, sort of like a third party person in the room that can kind of create an easier flow of communication, because it's like you're using this media to then have these, what would be maybe more difficult conversations of asking your partner what they're into, what would they like to try. Um, it's a really fun way to explore desires.
Yeah, I think it also breaks this boundary around fantasy sometimes. Like, I think if you're just having a plain conversation and you ask your partner, "What are you into?" or like, "What's a fantasy of yours?" I think sometimes you can feel caught off guard by like, "Oh my gosh, what should I say?" or you can't think of anything at the time, or you feel like awkward about the question. Whereas like in porn, if you're watching something together, there's this like, "Oh, like that could be interesting to try." And even if it's not something you necessarily want to try, it just kind of brings the fantasy to your mind. And I think sex can be a really playful and imaginative space as well. Um, and it just like gives that opportunity to have discussions, even if it's not something you want to do.
Exactly. And I think like a big, big key takeaway here is like, this can be a tough practice too for partners who are just getting comfortable with talking about sex with each other. Even though we should definitely be talking about sex with the people we're having sex with, absolutely. But keep an open mind. You know, don't yuck another person's yum. This doesn't mean that if your partner shows you something in a porn and says like, "Hey, I would love this," or "This is really turns me on," if you're not into it, it's okay to not be into it. But instead of kind of, you know, shaming them for it, instead you can kind of offer an alternative and be like, I'm not too sure about that, but what about this? You know, I
Mhm.
think there's a strength in offering alternatives than simple rejection. Especially because you might be using porn as a practice to begin communication. We don't want to shut it down.
Yeah, yeah, I can absolutely see that being the case. For people who like say like there's two people that have been together for a while and they do talk about sex in their daily lives together, but they've never like initiated watching porn together. And one person really wants to maybe say, "Hey, would you watch this with me?" What is the best way to go about that, in your opinion?
Ooh, that's a good one. And this is a couple who like are pretty open minded or
Yeah, yeah, I would say
sensitive.
like they talk about sex regularly, but it's not something that they
Okay.
yeah, it's they're like pretty open-minded and free to talk about things.
Yeah, so I think that I always feel like it's nice to kind of bring up these conversations in a way where it's not just like a yes or no answer, but you kind of leave it open for discussion. Um, because you want to leave that space for alternatives, right? Be like, and it doesn't have to be verbal. It can be nonverbal communication as well, like sending a text or a DM. And it could just be as simple as, I came across a really hot video today. I would love to share it with you. Would you feel comfortable about me showing this to you? Or like, how would you feel if I sent this to you? So there's ways that you can kind of expand the conversation. So you don't like just send a link, right? And then they open up their phone and there's a video there. You don't ever want to do that. Um, but it's just a nice way of kind of like checking the temperature on it, I would say.
Mhm.
But I would encourage it for sure, definitely.
Yeah, and then as we talk, like you were talking about shame earlier, and I know like so many people that I grew up with. I grew up in a religious environment and I went to a Baptist college, and so much around sexuality was shameful, including watching porn. And I remember it was a very like, it was a conversation that no one wanted to admit they were doing. Like everyone was doing it and you knew that it was a part of life, but everyone was a little like, put down essentially for masturbating, watching porn. Um, so I know a lot of women in particular who have struggled with that idea, even if they're years out of, feeling suppressed in their sexuality. There's still some shame there. What would your tips be for someone who really struggles with that internal shame around masturbation, and how could they approach their partner if they're maybe into the idea but they're like nervous about it? To get back into the
Okay.
conversation and what we were talking about, you mentioned sexologists and how they can be helpful, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
I'm I feel like that's a word that I hear a lot, but I think most people wouldn't know what a sexologist is. How do you define, because I know
Yes.
you're a sexologist. I love your Instagram name, by the way. Um, so cute. I just love it. I think it's so cool and on brand. But I would love to know like how you define sexologist and sexology, and what it means for you.
Wow. Okay, so a sexologist is a wonderful person who has studied human sexuality. I am a clinical sexologist, so I really studied the clinical aspects of it. So that means that someone with typically my profile would go into therapy. So meeting with clients who are individuals or partners, and working through a therapeutic process to tackle issues of shame, issues of understanding and exploring one's sexuality, one's identity, um, when it's all related to sexuality. And so I would say there's some sexologists who also have a background in psychology. So if someone is seeking out a therapist, it's always good to kind of look at, well, what is that person specialized in? Um, I also there's a lot. I also do educational things. So a sexologist could be in therapy, in education. So that means like putting on workshops and taking a more educational approach. I also helped Erica relaunch her sex education nonprofit project, Porn Conversation. So I developed curriculum, developed conversation guides for families to talk to young people about porn. And then also there's a research side of it. So there's sexologists who will work with research institutions such as, the Kinsey Institute, for example.
Mhm.
And so there's just a lot of varying ways that you can find sexologists out in the world doing great things. But that is like the easy way to break it down.
Yeah, I think the profession is so cool because it's so multifaceted and you can do so much with it. And it seems like everyone I've met who's a sexologist does very different things, and I think that that's so cool. Specifically, the education component I think is super cool. And you mentioned the bringing conversation to kids about porn. I talked to Erica a little bit about that when I met her the first time in LA. I thought that that was so amazing that that conversation is being had and that it's being done in a safe way, and that Erica Lust's team as a whole is working on that. I think that that's so cool and so needed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it ties into our conversation we had earlier where I was saying there's like these two things that are still like not very much spoken about in the sex education world, which is like masturbation and porn. And so since porn has been this tool of educating so many people about sex, and still today, it's important that it just becomes a topic and a part of sex education. And there's so many messages that we can take from porn that can teach us how to be safer sexual citizens. Everything from consent and communication, from contraceptive use, to bodies, right? Diversifying the body types and understanding that bodies that we see on in porn might not look like our own. And so
Mhm.
understanding that there's so many messages that we receive from it that we can kind of break down through porn literacy and truly understand that, you know, this is a fantasy that is created, reality looks different, but also there's so much that goes beyond behind the scenes that we're not aware of as consumers. So it's not a very good source of sex education. And that's what we hope to do through porn conversation and through all the behind the scenes um, videos that we create at Ercles, having people come on set is kind of saying like, hey, this is what really happens. There are these sex talks. There are rigorous STI testing. There
Mhm.
are these educational platforms that we're creating, and so we're really trying to shift that, um, I guess, the culture around how we speak about porn and how we experience it.
Yeah, and as outsiders, I think the natural inclination is to think that all porn is going to be done like in a back studio and it's not going to be ethical and there's not going to be those conversations. And people have this idea of what it would be like to be on a porn set. And as someone who has been on one, I can tell you it's not salacious. It's very safe. It feels like
Mm-hmm.
the women that were working on set were all wonderful. Like it was such a good experience for me, even as a person who works in sex and relationships writing, to be able to say, actually, wow, like this is a great environment, and it's not always what you might think when you think of porn.
What did you find the most surprising? Did you kind of find anything there when you were on set kind of surprising from what you thought it would be than the reality of what it was?
Yeah, so the film that they were working on was like one of those 20-minute, films based on someone that wrote in a
Sex
fantasy.
confessions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was so interesting. I didn't realize how much time actually goes into creating like B-roll for those. Like, the initial shots of like, male body parts and like how many models actually come in to be in those small snippets, and that there's so much that's not sex related. And that was surprising to
Yeah.
me because I just think like, people think you go on a porn set and it's like constant sex all the time, but in actuality, the sex was happening for maybe like an hour, like the scene filming. And I found that surprising.
Yeah, and I think like what you were on, which was like an X Confessions set, those are kind of our crowdsourced confessions that we create into films. And so I think what's also kind of sets Erica Lust apart is like there is such a strong narrative focus on our films, right? There's a story and everyone has names and there's costumes and hair and makeup to the T. And so these things will take a long time. And so you're right, like the B-roll is going to be super lengthy, but it's because it ends up being this piece of art, right? That includes a sex scene. but has this great, strong story behind it, more than just what you might typically see in free online porn. So, um, I agree. It's like a long day, but at the end, the sex scene will only be an hour tops.
Yeah, and it was fun to see that film come out and watch it with my partner and be like, oh, I like remember when they were doing this or that. And it really is a piece of art. It felt less like porn to me and more like, wow, this is just like visually beautiful to look at.
Absolutely. And it's like a very good reminder, too, that, media at the end of the day is like it goes through this like editing process, right? There when you're in like a film set, there's so much moving parts, and then you get that final product, and you're just like, wow, all of that is this, and like it all makes sense, and it's all so beautiful. It's just I feel like the opportunity to work with the crew and a production team is just always an incredibly huge learning opportunity. It's just this whole different world to
Mhm.
understand. And that's like what we're hoping to unveil all the time, because it's like, hey, this is how it really happens. This is what's really going on in what you're watching. Because it's, important to not have any feelings of non relatability in our porn. So we want people to feel a part of it. They want to feel represented in what they're watching. And so
Mhm.
that feels good to hear that from you.
Yeah, I one of the things that I think is really a standout for me about Erica Lust in general and the brand and the films that are created is that it really makes you feel a part of the experience in a different way than like tube sites do. So, for example, my partner and I, the first time that we ever watched, Lust Cinema together, both of us afterwards had a different feeling than we do if we just watched like a tube site video. It felt more connected. It felt so much more alive. There was like a different conversation to be had. And I think that there was also a difference in, the shots that were being taken. Like it wasn't just like showing genitals. It's like there's this whole story arc. And
Mhm.
um, I think we watched one, it was like a chocolate fantasy kind of thing. Like they were making chocolate
Yes,
together. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so fun. Like it's a story that you can be invested in too.
absolutely. Exactly. So there's always that like backstory to it that really adds to the experience as a consumer. Because I think we always see, like what you were saying, like the perspective. So having more women behind the camera is really going to change the final result. It's going to change what we're seeing. I think we might feel so disconnected from a lot of free online porn based on that they use these same old tired, what I like to call order of operations, right?
Mhm.
So always ending in the money shot, as they call it, um, and kind of like never really showing um, males face their experiences of pleasure, not really showing realistic body types, not really showing at all the communication between the performers, which I love about our films too, because oftentimes there'll be these really sweet conversations going on between performers during the sex scene, which we encourage, of course, and they get left in the film, and I'm like, oh, this is so good because that's the reality of having sex. We should be consistently communicating and talking and moving things around and like making sure each other are feeling good and feeling pleasure and feeling comfortable. And so I think if we start to begin to watch more media like that, it will positively affect our relationship with our sexuality and sex. It's just like any type of media, like following influencers who might make you feel horrible about yourself because they always have perfect skin and the perfect outfit and everything is curated and edited. Um, at the end of the day, to not feel so relatable, but to feel like it's this thing or this aesthetic that we're supposed to be achieving rather than just being real in ourselves.
I absolutely agree. I think so much of our lives are curated in that way, right? Like social media is such a highlight reel and porn, like mainstream porn is the same. Like you know, women in porn in that aspect usually don't look like most women that you see out in the real world, and then they start to judge themselves. Why don't I look like this? And I know from the masculinity side, men are like, oh, I'm supposed to be like, like jackhammering a woman, and that's what sex looks like. Like those were the depictions of like what sex should be. And I think for Erica Lust to include those sweet moments of conversation or laughing or playfulness, because sex isn't just like serious. Like you can have like moments of intimacy that are fun and playful, and like maybe there's like a weird sound or your body moves weird or whatever, but those moments are
Yeah.
real. And to include those is really cool. I think it's probably really helpful to people in normalizing like it. Sex does not have to be curated or look like one thing or the other.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And sex doesn't always have to mean ending in ejaculation, and it doesn't always have to mean always having, a hard on. It
Mhm.
doesn't have to mean looking and acting or saying specific things. Um, it can be your own experience. And so I think like the that kind of the common thread that leads to positive, safe, and pleasurable sexual experiences is always, always, always going to be consent and open communication.
Absolutely. Consent is key always. I love to put that in all of my pieces that I write because I think, it sounds like everyone knows consent is key, but it's so important to remember um, and include in all of your sexual practices. So I'm curious if you're working on anything that you're proud of at the moment, anything that you could share with us that maybe you're excited about, and also where people can find you on socials.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am always, always putting out there that we have this amazing nonprofit project called the Porn Conversation. You can find it at thepornconversation.org, or the P Conversation on Instagram, because God forbid we say the word porn on any meta accounts. But that is something I'm very, very proud to share. There's free and easily accessible sex education materials for young people, and this is dedicated to all the adults who have a young person in their life and they want to start having these conversations about porn, about sex, about pleasure in a very positive way. Also, I will be sharing an X Confessions free month for your listeners, which we will share with you. And
Nice.
yeah, just keep watching, keep exploring our wonderful platforms, and you can find all of our platforms at ericalust.com.
Amazing. And what is your Instagram? It's Sexology Girl,
Oh,
right? Yeah.
my my Instagram is Sexology Girl. That was the one you were talking about earlier, right? Yeah, it's
Yes, I think it's so
Sexology Girl.
cute. I love it. I love it. I think you really snagged a good one there because I feel like that would have been taken up very quickly. Well,
To
thank
the
you
point.
so much. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. I feel like I always feel so excited to talk to people in the industry and people who are doing really cool work and making positive change in the sex space. I just think that it's so cool and so needed. And I just am so encouraged by our conversation and everything that you're doing. And yeah, I just really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh my gosh, same to you. I love your work and what you're doing and what you're growing. So cool. So
Thank you
thanks
so
to you.
much.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to all Naked Folk platforms. You can find us on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook at handle Naked Folk. If you have any suggestions for future episodes or topics you'd like to hear more of, please make sure to let us know in the comment section. As always, have a great week and stay curious.